Happy New Year, everyone. We hope you all had a safe and peaceful holiday season. We're kicking it off this year by revisiting an older episode that we did on the Willard's Sooty Boubou. This was a bird that John and the team at the Field Museum were responsible for describing as a new species. We're kicking off a mini-series on the book The Feather Thief in a few weeks, so we wanted to share an episode that highlighted what John and Shannon do at the Field Museum before we kick that off. A bird specimen at the Field Museum is what led to describing the new species, and John tells us all about that and his trips to Africa to study the new species. Okay, go grab your binoculars and let's get into it. Welcome back, everyone. This is RJ with John, Shannon, and Amanda. So today we're going to talk about the... I'm going to start this over again.
I think you should have a blooper thing.
Yeah.
Now you're getting into tough ones, right?
Yeah,
These are not birds you're looking up in the Field Guide to North American Birds.
No, the Willard Sooty Boubou. So, John, do you want to kind of start it off? So this is a bird that, if I'm correct, you and the Field Museum were determined that it was a species. Yep. And were integral in kind of researching this, finding it, and determining that. And you were in the field there going to see this bird, right?
So I always like to say that the greatest thing about our job is some of the exploratory stuff we get to do. And one of the greatest things that can happen while you're doing that is to find new species. And this one is especially close to my heart because it's a amazing part of the world. And it's also one of the, finding a new species always has a story related to it. In other words, in this case, it's a great story about collections because the Field Museum, the Bird Division, has done field work in what's called the Albertine Rift of Africa, which is these montane areas that include the Ruwenzori Mountains, the Mountains of the Moon. But then there's this whole ridge of mountains that goes down on both sides of the rift into the countries of Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And they're very poorly known, but they have spectacular flora and fauna that's found nowhere else in the world. So it's a neat place to work. And back in the 90s, Tom Noske, Ben Marks, and some colleagues, including Charles Kahindo, a Congolese colleague, were working in a place called Bwindi National Park right on the edge, and they caught some of these black shrikes. And it turns out that these black shrikes in the genus Laniarius are actually fairly widespread across all of sub-Saharan Africa, and there are a number of different species.
But they're all black.
But they're all black.
Kind of and not very distinguishable.
And yet when we collect specimens, we're recording as much information as we can. And Tom Noske, our assistant collection manager, noted that the eyes on these birds were kind of blue-gray. And they came back to the Field Museum, and they were actually in the Field Museum collection for almost 10 years before Tom, it just kept bothering him that he thought that there were other black shrikes at higher elevations, actually, that we were catching in this part of the world that had brown eyes. And so he talked to a couple colleagues of ours, Gary Volker and Susma Reddy, about doing some genetic work. And so, as Shannon said, these are black shrikes. And so they gathered up material from frozen tissues and collections from multiple places, but also they got toe pads off of older specimens from various places to complete a data set to where they could look at all these species of black shrikes with a set of molecular markers.
You can get DNA out of the toe pads of birds. So if you cut a little piece off of the toe, that it preserves DNA, which is obviously something nobody knew, given that we didn't know the structure of DNA till recently. When these birds were collected, nobody knew we would use their toes to get access to their genomes.
And so, this was largely because Tom had this hunch that these birds might be different. And sure enough, they aren't even the closest relatives of the brown-eyed birds that are at higher elevations in the same area. They're more closely related to a population, which is now called a species by a lot of authorities, all the way out in the Cameroon highlands, all the way across the Congo Basin.
Oh, wow.
So I love the story because it shows how people like Tom just had the capacity to look at things, think about them, and then keep them in their minds over time. And
those things always fester in people's minds when you're around collections, because if you look at enough things, you're like, you don't have time to gather data on everything, but you store the weird things in mind. And you can see in the collections that happens to a lot of people. The specimens can be 100 years old. And so people have thought about this repeatedly, and they often leave. Mel Traylor was famous for leaving little notes in the collection of something that might trigger the next person who comes along to actually figure out what he's thinking about. And this is an exploratory thing. I mean, these birds sat in the same drawer beside each other for, in our collections since the beginning of our collections.
And it also highlights the value of survey work. So we've worked collaboratively for years with people in the Albertine Rift area. And so another colleague of ours, Julian Kurbis, who's on the paper, who's a mammologist, was working in Burundi, and he happened to be collecting both birds and mammals, and he got an additional specimen of this bird. And so it turns out what we think is going on, it looks like, with this bird is that Willard Sooty Boubou occurs in mid-elevation forest below 2,000 meters in the Albertine Rift, and above 2,000 meters is another species, which is very common. And then below it is another member of the genus, and that's spread all the way across the Congo Basin. So this bird is kind of sandwiched at a mid-elevation range.
Wow.
And the other aspect of this, which we did some work on later, is that those forests up to 2,000 meters in this area are incredibly fertile and also occur in areas where there's very high human population density. So one of the things I like to point out to people with respect to Willard Sooty Boubou is it's a new species that was described in 2010, and it's also probably in one of the most endangered habitats in sub-Saharan Africa because of the historic population densities that have always been across that part of the region.
So how many would you guess are there in that population? I mean, if you were to...
So this is still an open question. And the interesting thing is once you describe something like this, you can look around. What we did was we looked around for other suitable regions where there was habitat below 2,000 meters and above probably about 1,300 meters.
And you can use technology to help you with
Right.
that these days. So you don't just kind of think it. You can actually input data into sophisticated computer modeling programs having to do with the environment and the habitat, and it can explore where this bird
Where there might be suitable habitat.
So you don't just have to guess. If you're going to go looking for it, you can have more informed looks.
So for example, one of the places that lit up was a national park in Rwanda, and sure enough, it's called Nyungwe National Park, and it's a spectacular piece of forest that's outside of Kigali, Rwanda, which again is very heavily populated. And there are some areas in that national park that get down below 2,000 meters. And sure enough, the bird tour people take groups there, and they started looking for the bird, and they were able to find it. Now, there's another aspect of this, which is vocalizations. And one of the amusing things to me about this was we didn't know what this bird sounded like when we described it, and we actually got some grief for that in the review process because people were saying, well, it's got to sing differently, doesn't it? And we thought maybe, but we've got enough data to describe this as a new species anyways. And one of our colleagues, Josh Engel, and I made a trip over to the type locality in Bwindi National Park a few years later, and we met up with a Ugandan tour guide leader named Alfred, who, when we got there, said, "Oh yeah, they sound completely different. I can show you on it." And he had been on the original trip with the folks when they first got the bird and had been following what was going on with respect to splitting out the Willard Sooty Boubou. And sure enough, we went into the park and we got recordings, and Then I went into some of the compilations of African bird songs that you can get. There's a very amazing piece of work by a guy named Claude Chapuis where it's basically birds of sub-Saharan Africa and their recordings of things. And some of the experts on the Albertine Rift had recordings of both species under the name of the higher elevation bird because they just didn't know there were two things there. And so what they were saying was, well, this bird has a really diverse repertoire where it sings a couple different things. And it turns out, no, this is one of these is actually Willard Sooty Boubou, and the other one is Linearis poensis, which is, I got to get my
common names.
Yeah, Western Sooty Boubou. Albertine Sooty Boubou.
For me, I love this story because these birds have been sitting together in the collections for 150 years of collections.
And they look the same?
And they look really the same if you just look at them superficially.
There's some measurement differences, but they're black strikes.
Yeah, and so if you open the drawer, on the tag, there's a tag associated with every specimen that has, we've evolved through time, but minimally it should have something having to do with the location and the date, who collected it. And then if you're lucky, there are things like soft part colors. What color was the eye? What color is the feet? What color is any facial skin? Things like that. And those will be on the tag. So you have a hypothesis. This blue-eyed bird, maybe it's a juvenile. And maybe that's just like part of the plumage maturation, the maturation of the bird. Maybe it's a juvenile. Or maybe it's something different. And so you make these hypotheses. You go back, you look at the tags and see what was described. If you're lucky, the eye color was described on the tag and is noted. And then you can go back, once you have gathered some data, you can go back and ask the question, are all the blue-eyed birds each other's closest relatives? And the answer to that was yes, they are. And they're not part of the things that they've been nested in the same drawer of for 100 years. Wow. Not only aren't they part of that, they're not even closely related. They're way outside. So the looks don't tell you about relationships necessarily. And to me, that's just, I don't even know how many stories are going to be like that from collections. When people really look, we all make assumptions about what is known. And then every once in a while you get someone like Tom who's like, this is dodgy to me. There's something else that's going on. You find a new species that has an extremely narrow distribution and might be critically endangered. That might be helping you save certain aspects of habitat. You just don't know where it's going to go. The one thing you do know is that the collections will be at the root of whatever you do.
So you have this kind of, discovery that these are all related, all these blue-eyed ones. What's the next step to kind of show everyone, like, this is what we found, how do we get this in the records?
So Gary, Sushma, and Tom literally started putting together as much data as they could from all the different specimens of black boubous that they could get access to in both North America and in Europe. And this is an interesting thing. I mean, there aren't a lot of specimens in places in Africa, so they're outside. And at the same time, they're there. And so they were able to put together that pattern by requesting topad samples from some of the key populations and then putting that together into this genetic data set. And so the genetics played a really key role in convincing people that this was actually a different species.
Yeah, you wouldn't open those drawers if you didn't know something about eye color. You wouldn't open those drawers and say, yeah, there's something else going on. I mean, there are other measurement differences that are fairly subtle, and you might not pick up on them. And you would just trust the fact that they have a label, right? We put a species name on that. Turns out it wasn't true, but we do that. We put our best estimate of what the taxonomy, what it's called, what its genus and species is. And you hope there are things like elevation. So that's something that we do now, and we have sophisticated ways of getting elevation. In the past, hasn't always been so so sophisticated. So we take all this stuff in the field too, because you want to maximize what every specimen can contribute to science. Take the most data from it that you can. That includes parasites. That includes stomach contents. All of these things that we do now, images of them in the field if we can, song recordings. All of this stuff now helps us uncover these mysteries of diversity.
And coming back to what Shannon was saying earlier about sort of the conservation importance of all this, there's still a lot more to learn about this bird. I mean, we literally don't know much more than...
Has anybody described its nest?
Nope.
Yeah.
No. And
which is not uncommon for birds. We don't know anything about what their nests are.
And that's the Albertine Rift is a really hard place to move around. These forests are really dense, and
so you've gone there though, and observed them in the field. And how was that? What was it like going there? And
it was fun, And again, the interesting thing is, I'd worked there actually before we knew this bird existed, and then suddenly we knew this bird existed, and now it became really interesting to try to find other places where it did exist. And at the same time, that's kind of frustrating. So, for instance, there's a spectacular area south of, in the southern part of the Albertine Rift called the Atombwe Plateau, which is in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's one of the most interesting and dangerous places I've ever been in my life.
Oh, wow.
And we were working on the east side of the plateau and hoping to find Willard Sooty Boubou in that area. And we got there, and there were literally nothing but fingers of forest below 2,000 meters.
Oh.
And we worked there for a little bit, and we did not find the bird. We did not hear it. And I think it still could be there in a few patches. But one of the things that we'd love to do is do more survey work on the west side of the Atombwe Plateau going into the Congo Basin, because it ought to be there too, and it's just too dangerous to go there. And we always work with Congolese colleagues and trust their intuition on this, and we could talk for hours about what it's like to do field work in these areas, but the trip that we were on that time was cut short in part because there was a possibility that we might run into people that we didn't want to run into. So we moved out of the area sooner than we wanted to.
So you have... Oh, go ahead.
You read my mind. I was wondering what you meant by dangerous. So you meant scary people.
This is... Yeah.
They're war zones, right, in these places, and bands of mostly men who are going places to do things, and if they don't like you stick out like a sore thumb.
Right.
They don't like you.
Well, it's dangerous for everybody. It's dangerous for the Congolese researchers, and so it's a spectacular area, and all the biologists would love to know more about what's going on, but it's a very difficult place to work with respect to the kinds of groups that you could potentially run into out there.
And then so you have like a local guide and people from the government that are telling you this is safe, safe time. Now it's starting to shift.
That's an interesting point about this specific area when we were in the Atombwe Plateau, because this was a time where there was a general named Intaganda who had been brought into the government to hopefully quell down some of the rebel. He was a rebel, and he was brought into the government specifically hoping to take care of some of these problems that exist. But there's so many little militia groups out there, and he got frustrated with the government, and he decided to leave. And he actually he was trying to rally his troops together, and they had been dispersed by the government north and south of where we were.
Oh my gosh.
And we were told at one point that there were groups from the south that were moving north to join the forces, and we were a little worried about whether, what would happen if they ran into us in our camp on the foothills of the Atombwe Plateau. And so it was just it's a fascinating place to work, and one of the most important things I always say is I absolutely trust the guys that we work with there, our colleagues, and when they said, I think we should go, it was like, let's head out.
Let's go.
I mean, we always want to make sure we find the people where our skills can help them preserve their own biodiversity, educate people in their regions, have access to our museum and the training aspects that we can provide. You always want to leave the scientific infrastructure better than it was when you got there.
And this part of the Congo, which may or may not have Willard Sooty Boubou, has an amazing group of scientists who've been dealing with a Rwandan genocide and 20 years of insecurity since then, and are still trying to study the biodiversity of that part of the world. One of our closest colleagues is rector of a university, and so in a city of Bukavu, which has over 1 million people in it. And so you start realizing that even though most people have no idea what goes on in this part of the world, most of the people there are literally just trying to move their lives along and have an education system that creates opportunities for their children. And so it's just a fascinating part of the world. And at the same time, there are these, there's the biodiversity out there like Willard Sooty Boubou. And, the good news is there are national parks, and those national parks are actually preserving populations of things like Willard Sooty Boubou. And so I have as chaotic as it can be, I have a lot of hope for the future of that region, with the one caveat being that we've got to continue to monitor it, because one of the predictions of climate change is that some of those habitats are going to have to move up elevation as the climate warms. And if that's true, that's going to potentially push Willard Sooty Boubou into a narrower and narrower set of suitable habitat over time. We just don't know.
Wow. Do you have any plans to go back? Is there any?
So we're in constant contact with our colleagues there. Money's always an issue, but there is discussion of an expedition we always work with the mammalogists at the Field Museum, and there's some folks that are going back and working on bats right now, and it's a big collaboration with some biologists from Kenya. And so that's the other neat thing about this, is watching the evolution of the sub-Saharan African scientific community that's crossing boundaries and beginning to work in different countries. The historic part of this particular part of the world is that everything east of the Albertine Rift is Francophone in terms of the European influence, and everything west is Anglophone. And that's actually created huge problems for biodiversity science over the years, because the Francophone researchers didn't communicate with the Anglophone researchers. And so when people were the conservation community was initially putting together things like areas of endemism, where they thought there were specifically high levels of endemism that deserved conservation priority, they couldn't come up with an estimate for how many species were in the Albertine Rift, because the literature was either in French or English, and for plants in particular, they couldn't figure out how many endemic plants there were to that part of the world.
Oh, wow.
So there's all kinds of interesting problems that can come up. For years with birds, there wasn't a good field guide for the Albertine Rift, because all the Francophone things dealt with stuff in West Africa, all the Anglophone things dealt with stuff in Kenya and Tanzania. And the Albertine Rift had all these endemic birds that were never depicted in a field guide.
Oh, wow.
And it's neat to see that change.
Yeah.
So now everything is kind of, with technology, has become more cohesive. And
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
And then, John, do you actually camp when you're out there?
Oh, yeah.
You do?
Yep. Yep.
What do you guys eat?
Good question. A lot of beans and rice and things. Yeah.
Are there any, is the wildlife out there is completely different than here? Is there any danger of running into something that could threaten you?
So one of the things that I've never experienced, but colleagues of ours at the museum have, is chimpanzees are around.
Oh,
wow. Chimpanzees, as cool as they are cunning animals, and so they've been known to take birds out of mist nets and things, and you wouldn't want to argue with a grown chimpanzee in the forest.
Oh gosh.
There are also gorillas, but gorillas are herbivores, and so they're off doing their own thing. But one of the most amazing things you can do in this part of the world is get the opportunity to go see gorillas, and I've done that a number of times, and it's spectacular. He
called me on the satellite phone the day he did that, and our son had locked himself in the bathroom on the main floor of our townhouse. He was 2, and I couldn't get the door open. He was in there for hours, and I had to take our cat to the vet and have her euthanized because her cancer had finally done her in. I'm like, oh, that's great, John. I am glad you enjoyed your trip with the gorillas.
Poor Shannon.
How about you call me later after I take the door off the hinges, get our son out of the bathroom.
Oh my gosh.
It's true. That's you probably don't even remember that part of the story because he had a much better day than I did.
Yes.
I was on the phone crying with my father. How do I get the door off? I can't get him out, and he's too little to the thing you're supposed to be able to stick something through the door was misaligned, so I had to take the door off of its hinges.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So I had one question about like recording. So you actually were in the field and recorded the bird making a call too, right?
Yep.
So somebody has a device. I mean, how does record? Like, I don't understand like the technology of recording bird calls.
Well, we should get some experts in here because I'm not one of them. But,
okay.
But the funny thing is, if you really want to do it well, you take an expensive shotgun mic, and you might have even a parabola, which is a big piece of plastic like a radar.
It kind of looks like the cone of shame that you put on a cat or a dog, except it's rather large.
But it can provide you with additional focus of the sound such that you get very clear quality sound. So there's a lot of different. I mean, the one thing that's changing, of course, is today you could take an iPhone out there, and the microphone on that iPhone is probably good enough to get a usable vocalization recording for a lot of these situations. But
are you just waiting for a certain time, or is there something you're doing? I mean, do you know a certain time of day is better to hear?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the best time to be out recording a lot of times is early in the morning because dawn choruses, particularly in the tropics, tend to be particularly strong, and then as it gets warmer, the birds stop calling for the most part.
Okay. In
this particular case, I remember in Bwindi National Park in Uganda when we were trying to get the recording, we went up the trail with Alfred and we didn't have any Sooty Boubous for the longest time. We were seeing lots of these really interesting lowland birds, which occur in Uganda only in Bwindi National Park and a few other lowland places along the Congolese border. But he kept saying, we're going to run into it. We're going to run into it. And sure enough, we ran into it. And as soon as it started calling and Josh was recording it, it began to rain really hard. And so you can actually hear the rainfall in the background of the recording, but it's I
think it works best if you have someone dedicated to doing that. Like everything, you get better at understanding where to stand, how to direct your mic, how the parabola works when you kind of are doing that all the time. So, and there are some people who are just really, really, really good at.
The other thing I think is worth mentioning here is there are these incredible sound archives now. So the Macaulay Library at Cornell University is one. There's a thing out of the Naturalis Museum in the Netherlands. There's an incredible website called Zinacanto. And so anybody that records birds and other sounds can actually deposit these just like you could a specimen in a collection. And that's a really valuable thing. And one of the things I like to say about Zinacanto, which I love specifically with reference to Willard's Sooty Boubou, is that there was a debate about what this bird sounded like. And so Josh posted these recordings on Zinacanto, and there's the capacity in the Zinacanto website to comment on the recordings. And so one of the neat things is a discussion ensued as the people with experience in other parts of the Albertine Rift started listening to these recordings and saying, oh, wait, I heard this here, and this is what it's, and so I love it because it's another example of almost community science in a way that I don't think anybody would have ever thought of that comes about because of the technology that people have and the ability to get out into the field and record stuff like that.
Cornell has provided a lot to kind of biology in general through these public databases. eBird is transformational in terms of what we know about birds and started in North America, but it's rapidly growing in terms of where there are observations. And the sounds is another thing. It's a public database, so anybody who has an idea about things has access to some information. It's like that GenBank is another thing. You can't get DNA-based studies published if you don't deposit your sequences in a public database, and then they become open for everybody in the world to use. And I think we only make big transformations with public resources, and I think these things should be supported by the government. That no one institution could handle GenBank. That has to be supported by the government. I think there are other resources that should be supported by government.
It's funny you brought that up because one of the things I wasn't going to mention with this in the 2010 paper was there was this one sequence that we downloaded from GenBank. So that's another thing you can do is you can augment your study by what's already been sequenced of other things. And so Gary and Sushma did that when they were creating the data set. And there was this weird thing where there was a Cameroon specimen of a Laniarius that clustered very closely with the high elevation Poensis birds from the Albertine Rift. And it always bothered me. And because I thought, well, maybe that means there are two species in Cameroon, some birds that are closer to Willardi and some birds that are closer to the high elevation species Poensis. And it took me a long time, but I eventually tracked down where that sequence came from, and it was a specimen in the Paris Museum, or sample in the Paris Museum, and I wrote the curator, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's a mistake. That bird isn't actually from Cameroon. It's actually from the Albertine Rift." And so it was going exactly where it should have gone, but because they misinterpreted something along the way, and it got put with Cameroon, it put a whole different light up potentially on some of the stuff that might be going on population biology wise.
And that's why things that are, you have to verify things that are in these public databases as well. And that includes our specimens. We could have things that are misidentified and we've loaned them out to people and someone comes back and said, no, it's not this. And then it becomes a mystery of why what was in that tube is not what this person is finding in their study. And it all helps our databases to be better. These aspects of community. It can only happen if you deposit things publicly and are willing to take criticism when things are wrong. A lot of what's in GenBank is not correct. And the only way to correct it is to trace it back to the original specimen that it came from. And if all you're doing is going out in the environment and taking blood and depositing that, you can't go back to the original individual and say, oh yeah, I misidentified it. And even birds, it is not so easy to identify a bird. And making mistakes is pretty common and humbling for people who think it is pretty easy. But you can, and with our specimens, you can always go back to the individual and take a look and say, yeah, I misidentified this thing. I didn't have enough comparative material to know it was something different. And it's really important that these public databases, that the specimen information and the institution that the specimen's in is really highly visible, and that you cannot deposit things into these databases without the museum information too. Otherwise, your science isn't as good as it could be.
All right. Well, this has been so much fun. I really enjoyed this. I do have one more question. We've talked so much about its call. How would you describe the Willard Sooty Boubou's call? What does it sound like?
Yeah, it's kind of a series of whistles. Okay. But it probably does some scolds too, and that's been one of the hard things. Is I still don't think that's completely ironed out. Is how different the scolds are of Willard Sooty Boubou from the higher elevation thing, and so there's still work to do on some of this, and so that's the other aspect of all of this, is that this is a starting point where there's more to learn. As we said, nobody knows anything about the nesting biology of Willard Sooty Boubou.
Yeah. We don't complete anything. That's a little dirty little secret about science. The best science just creates more questions than it ever answers, and so there's no end point. There's just branching points where you go down different branches of the questions that you have. And the specimens are always going to be part of any branch that you go down. So if you're like me that's why I like to clean, because it's something you can finish, right? Yes, I did those dishes. Yes, I vacuumed this floor, but nothing else in our life is like that.
I was going to say, doesn't that drive you crazy to not have closure sometimes? Or
well, it is, but
it's just
it's so. It expands your mind so much.
Sure.
We'll never be out of a job, because I think we teach science as if it's a box of facts, and you can learn every little piece in the box, and then you're good, right? You can pass a test. But science is open. It's not closed.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to get your mind around the fact that you just stop along the way and tell people about what you found, and then you keep moving, because almost certainly where you thought you'd be at that point at the beginning is not where you actually are, and it's not where you're going to be in the end. So it's just this gradual accumulation of knowledge, and with changing technologies, you can do things you didn't know you could do 10 years ago, and you get collaborations with people who have all different kinds of skills and expertise. So it becomes kind of magic.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been so great. I think this is probably a good place to call it for this episode. Thank you both so much. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, it's a great story.
You can tell we like talking about these things.
Yeah, and the person it was named after is a really important person.
Oh, yeah.
In the museum.
Let's talk about him real quick. So this is...
Sorry, I didn't want to leave it without telling you who we named it after and why. Go ahead.
Well, Dave Willard has been collection manager of birds at the Field Museum for upwards of 40 or 45 years, and he's retired now, but he still comes in all the time. He's the person who created the digital databases for the Field Museum bird collection, and went through and literally handled every single bird in the collection in the effort to do that. So he's handled
500,000 at the time, and now it's almost 600,000.
Yeah, and so he's made an incredible contribution to global ornithology because of the importance of that collection and making it accessible to people. And he's also a great ornithologist and a really great mentor. And one of the things I love about him most is he has this ingrained, which was here, but Dave was already here when Shannon and I got our jobs, and as one example, you guys would have seen this. There's a cabinet that I like to call the Gee Whiz drawer at the Field Museum, and that's all Dave recognizing that there was really value in bringing people into the collection and showing them the behind the scenes and talking to them about why we had this material. And that Gee Whiz drawer was something he developed over time as he came up with little vignettes that he thought would resonate with people more effectively. So he's just an incredible ornithologist, and it was really... What
I love about that drawer is that it charts the history of the people who have come through, because everybody gives a tour from that drawer completely differently. So you're standing at the same drawer, same specimens, but everybody does it differently. So if you can look back at the history of students of ours who have come and see there's a little tray that's in the drawer with the specimens that they like to talk about. So it really charts kind of the fact that the specimens are at the base, but that everybody tells their own stories about whatever specimens that they have access to. Yeah. So, and that comes from Dave. Dave's a great storyteller, and that ethos is really strong in the bird division at the Field Museum. The desire to make sure people know why we have birds, why we preserve them, what you can do to help, and that, birds are amazing, and bird feathers and bird collections are amazing too.
Well, that drawer definitely had an impact on Amanda and I. That's really what got us so interested in wanting to meet both of you and talk with you. So That's amazing that came from him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, I think we'll call it then.
Okay.
Yeah. John, you want to close it?
Yeah. I'll just close it with, in this case, this episode with the idea that, here's a bird occurring in a really remote part of the world, and one of the greatest things about birds is they're literally everywhere on the planet. And so you pretty much can't go anywhere. You can't see some interesting birds. And the Albertine Rift is definitely very special in that respect.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. In case you missed our announcement last week, we wanted to tell you again, we're going to be doing a little mini-series on the book The Feather Thief, around 4 or 5 episodes, where we'll break down the book in more detail, and then are going to chat with the author, Kirk Wallace Johnson. We're super excited about this. If you aren't familiar with the book, it's true crime and birds and museums and just the wildest true story. As curators of birds at the Field Museum in Chicago, John and Shannon are the perfect people to break it all down. From Alfred Russel Wallace's bird collection, some of which are in the Field Museum with John and Shannon, to talking a little bit more about some of the rare birds that were stolen in the book, to the importance of museum collections and the value that they serve to the science community, to the horrific crime that was committed in the book. There's a lot to discuss, and we're super pumped to dive into it in more detail. Okay, that's it for this week. Reminder, if you have a question, you can reach us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. I love you all. Thanks, everyone, for listening.